28th June, 1918. The day the world believed it had achieved peace would become the very day it planted the seeds of an even deadlier war. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles Palace, German representatives sat humiliated before the Allied powers, forced to sign a treaty that would reshape Europe and ignite resentments burning for 2 decades. The Great War had finally ended 7 months earlier on the 11th of November 1918, after 4 years of unprecedented carnage that claimed 17 million lives. The victorious Allies, primarily Britain, France, and the United States, gathered to determine Germany's fate. What emerged was not merely a peace treaty but a document of retribution that historians would later recognize as a roadmap to catastrophe. French Premier Georges Clemenceau, who had witnessed Prussian troops occupy Paris in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War, demanded Germany be crushed beyond recognition. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, pressured by a vengeful public chanting, "Squeeze Germany until the pips squeak," pushed for harsh economic penalties. American President Woodrow Wilson, despite advocating for his idealistic 14 points, found himself outmaneuvered by European pragmatism and old-world vengeance. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of 13% of its European territory and all its overseas colonies. The industrial heartland of the Saar Basin fell under League of Nations control for 15 years. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Rhineland would be permanently demilitarized, occupied by Allied forces for 15 years, creating a buffer zone that Germans viewed as a dagger pointed at their heartland. Military restrictions proved equally devastating. Germany's armed forces were limited to 100,000 men, a fraction of its previous military might. The General Staff was dissolved. The Navy was reduced to a coastal defense force. Submarines, military aircraft, and tanks were completely forbidden. For a nation that had prided itself on military prowess since the days of Frederick the Great, these terms represented not just defeat, but deliberate humiliation. According to research published in Margaret Macmillan's Paris 1919, the most poisonous clause proved to be Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war and all resulting damages. This single paragraph would fuel nationalist rage for generations, providing demagogues with endless propaganda ammunition. The reparations demands staggered the imagination. Initially set at 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to $33 billion at the time, the sum represented more than 3 times Germany's annual national income. British economist John Maynard Keynes, who attended the conference as a Treasury representative, resigned in protest and published The Economic Consequences of the Peace, warning that such punitive measures would destabilize Europe and breed future conflict. His prophecy would prove tragically accurate. In Germany, the treaty created immediate political turmoil. The Weimar Republic, barely 6 months old, faced an impossible choice: sign the treaty and face accusations of betrayal from nationalists, or refuse and watch Allied armies march deeper into German territory. On the 28th of June 1919, they signed. That same day, right-wing groups began propagating the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth, claiming Germany's undefeated army had been betrayed by weak politicians, socialists, and Jews. The treaty dismantled the Austro-Hungarian Empire, creating new nations like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and an independent Poland. The latter received the Polish Corridor, a strip of formerly German territory providing access to the Baltic Sea, which separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The port city of Danzig became a free city under League of Nations protection. These territorial arrangements, designed to honor Wilson's principle of national self-determination, instead created ethnic tensions and irredentist claims that would explode 2 decades later. As Allied leaders departed Versailles believing they had secured lasting peace, few recognized they had created a powder keg. The treaty left Germany economically crippled, militarily impotent, territorially diminished, and psychologically wounded, a humiliated nation awaiting someone to promise restoration of its former glory. 1 January 1923, German housewife Frau Schmidt carried a wheelbarrow full of paper money to buy a single loaf of bread. a surreal scene that would become the defining image of Weimar Germany's hyperinflation crisis. What began as economic instability from the Treaty of Versailles transformed into complete monetary collapse, creating conditions that would make extremism attractive to millions of desperate Germans. The Weimar Republic faced insurmountable financial burdens from its inception: war debts, reconstruction costs, and the looming shadow of reparations payments created a perfect storm. When Germany fell behind on reparation payments in 1922, French and Belgian troops occupied the industrial Ruhr Valley on the 11th of January, 1923. The German government responded with passive resistance, paying Ruhr workers to strike while productivity ceased. This decision, though popular politically, proved economically catastrophic. To pay striking workers while tax revenues plummeted, the government printed money at astronomical rates. The mark, which stood at 4.2 to 1 United States dollar before the war, began its death spiral. By November 1923, the exchange rate reached 4.2 trillion marks to $1. Prices doubled every few days. Workers demanded to be paid twice daily so they could rush to shops before their wages became worthless. Life savings evaporated overnight. The middle class, traditionally Germany's stabilizing force, watched their security disintegrate. Photographs from this period show children building towers with worthless banknotes, wallpaper made from currency, and people using money to fuel their stoves because it was cheaper than buying firewood. The psychological trauma of this hyperinflation would haunt German memory for generations, making people desperate for stability at any cost and deeply suspicious of democratic institutions that seemed unable to protect them. Gustav Stresemann, who became chancellor in August 1923, finally stabilized the currency by introducing the Rentenmark in November, but the damage extended far beyond economics. Social cohesion collapsed. Crime rates soared. Political extremism flourished on both left and right. Communist uprisings erupted in several cities. Right-wing paramilitary groups, the Freikorps, fought street battles with communist militias. Political assassinations became commonplace. Matthias Erzberger, who signed the armistice, was murdered in 1921. Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau fell to assassins' bullets in 1922. On the 8th and 9th of November 1923, a failed World War I corporal named Adolf Hitler attempted to seize power in Munich during what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Though the coup failed, and Hitler received a 5-year prison sentence serving only 9 months, he gained national attention and learned a crucial lesson. Power must be achieved through legal means, not armed rebellion. Meanwhile, a brief period of relative stability emerged between 1924 and 1929. American loans, particularly the Dawes Plan of 1924, helped rebuild German industry. The Locarno Treaties of 1925 normalized relations with Western neighbors. Germany joined the League of Nations in 1926. Economic growth returned. Unemployment fell. Berlin flourished as a cultural capital. The Golden Twenties brought cabarets, cinema, jazz, and artistic innovation. Many believed democracy had finally taken root in German soil. This stability proved tragically illusory. The German economy depended heavily on short-term American loans that could be recalled at any moment. According to Adam Tooze's economic analysis in The Wages of Destruction, this created a house of cards vulnerable to any external shock. That shock came with devastating force. 24th October 1929, Black Thursday. Wall Street crashed, triggering a global economic catastrophe that would dwarf even Germany's hyperinflation crisis. American loans dried up immediately. International trade collapsed. German unemployment, which stood at 1.3 million in September 1929, exploded to over 6 million by early 1933. Industrial production fell by 40%. 1 in 3 workers found themselves unemployed. Young men who had never known anything but economic chaos wandered streets without hope or prospects. The Great Depression devastated the entire world, but it struck Germany with particular ferocity. Bitter memories of hyperinflation combined with massive unemployment created a volatile mixture of fear, anger, and desperation. Democratic politicians seemed helpless against the crisis. Moderate parties lost support to extremists on both ends of the political spectrum. Communist Party membership swelled. So did the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazis, whose brown-shirted stormtroopers increasingly dominated German streets. Germany's democracy, less than 15 years old, faced its ultimate test without the economic resources, political legitimacy, or social cohesion needed for survival. The economic apocalypse created exactly the conditions extremists required. Someone needed only to channel this despair into political power, promising simple solutions to complex problems, offering scapegoats for inexplicable suffering, and pledging to restore Germany's wounded pride. Mussolini's rise offered crucial lessons for aspiring dictators. The former socialist journalist had transformed himself into Italy's Duce by exploiting post-war disillusionment, fear of communism, wounded national pride from Italy's mutilated victory at Versailles, and weak democratic institutions unable to cope with economic crisis and social unrest. His fascist party combined ultra-nationalism, violent anti-communism, promises of order and stability, appeals to ancient Roman glory, and theatrical displays of strength that captivated masses desperate for decisive leadership. The fascist model proved particularly attractive to Germany. Like Italy, Germany felt humiliated by the peace treaties. Like Italy, Germany faced economic chaos and communist threats. Like Italy, Germany's democracy seemed weak and ineffectual. The key difference was scale. Germany possessed industrial capacity, military tradition, and geopolitical position that would make German fascism infinitely more dangerous than Mussolini's version. Adolf Hitler studied Mussolini's tactics while imprisoned after his failed 1923 putsch. In Landsberg prison, he dictated Mein Kampf, My Struggle, outlining his worldview combining rabid anti-Semitism, social Darwinism, Lebensraum theory, demanding German territorial expansion eastward, obsessive hatred of Versailles Treaty, contempt for democracy, and cult of personality centered on the Führer principle. Hitler emerged from prison in December 1924, determined to achieve power legally. The Nazi Party remained marginal throughout the Golden Twenties, receiving only 2.6% in the 1928 elections. But Hitler built a formidable propaganda machine led by Joseph Goebbels, organized a paramilitary force of stormtroopers, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, created elaborate rallies combining pagan symbolism and modern stagecraft, and crafted messages targeting specific groups. Workers received promises of jobs, industrialists heard anti-communist rhetoric, farmers got pledges of agricultural protection, and everyone received scapegoats, primarily Jews, blamed for Germany's suffering. Heinrich Brüning, chancellor from 1930 to 1932, governed through emergency presidential decrees rather than parliamentary majorities, inadvertently normalizing authoritarian governance. When Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg ran for re-election as president in March 1932, Hitler challenged him, receiving 37% in the runoff, a terrifying show of strength for an extremist party that barely existed 4 years earlier. Then Papen and his allies made history's most catastrophic political calculation. Believing they could domesticate Hitler by surrounding him with traditional conservatives, they convinced the aging Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. Papen would serve as vice-chancellor, with only 3 Nazis in an 11-member cabinet. Papen smugly told critics, "We have hired him for our act." Within months, Hitler would destroy them all. The appointment received surprisingly limited opposition. Communist Party, following Moscow's orders, focused more on fighting social democrats than fascists. Business leaders welcomed someone who promised order and crushed unions. Military officers appreciated nationalist rhetoric and rearmament promises. International observers largely dismissed Hitler as a temporary phenomenon who would either moderate or fail. British diplomat Robert Van Sittart was a rare voice warning of catastrophe. But few listened to such alarmists during Depression's desperate days. Hitler moved with breathtaking speed to consolidate absolute power. On the 27th of February 1933, the Reichstag building erupted in flames. A Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested at the scene, though historians still debate whether the fire was purely his action or involved Nazi complicity. Regardless, Hitler seized the opportunity with masterful cynicism. Within hours, Hitler convinced President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, suspending civil liberties including freedom of speech, press, assembly, and privacy. 4,000 communist officials were arrested overnight. Constitutional protections vanished. The decree, theoretically temporary, would remain in force until 1945, providing legal cover for 12 years of totalitarian rule. Elections held on the 5th of March 1933 occurred under conditions of terror and intimidation. Stormtroopers prevented opposition rallies, beat political enemies, and occupied polling stations. Despite this, Nazis received only 43.9%, still requiring coalition partners for majority control. Hitler needed something more permanent than electoral victories that could theoretically be reversed. He needed to destroy democracy legally, with its own approval. The Enabling Act, presented to the Reichstag on the 23rd of March 1933, requested Parliament authorize Hitler's government to pass laws without parliamentary consent or presidential approval for 4 years. Constitutional amendments required 2/3 majority, meaning Hitler needed support beyond his Nazi nationalist coalition. He secured it through mixture of intimidation, false promises, and political maneuvering. The session convened at the Kroll Opera House, with SA and SS troops lining the building. Otto Wels, leader of the Social Democratic Party, delivered a courageous speech opposing the act. "We German Social Democrats pledge ourselves solemnly in this historic hour to the principles of humanity and justice, of freedom and socialism. No enabling act can give you power to destroy ideas which are eternal and indestructible." Wels would flee to exile. Many of his colleagues would die in concentration camps. The Catholic Center Party, hoping Hitler would honor promises to protect church interests, voted yes. Only Social Democrats voted no. Communist deputies were already arrested or in hiding. The Enabling Act passed with 441 votes to 94, effectively ending German democracy. Parliamentarians had voted themselves into irrelevance. Hitler would renew the act periodically through 1943, though by then it was meaningless formality. Absolute dictatorship required no legal pretense. The Nazi coordination, Gleichschaltung, proceeded systematically. Trade unions dissolved on the 2nd of May 1933. Political parties were banned or dissolved themselves by July. State governments lost autonomy. The civil service was purged of Jews and political opponents. Universities dismissed Jewish professors. Book burnings destroyed un-German literature. The Gestapo, secret state police, was established under Hermann Göring, later transferred to Heinrich Himmler's control. President Hindenburg died on the 2nd of August 1934. Hitler immediately merged the offices of President and Chancellor, declaring himself Führer and Reich Chancellor. The military swore personal oaths of loyalty to Hitler, not to constitution or state. A fateful decision that would bind Wehrmacht officers even when they recognized Hitler was leading Germany to destruction. One final obstacle remained. The SA stormtroopers who had terrorized Hitler's opponents now threatened to become ungovernable. Ernst Röhm, SA leader, commanded 4 million brown shirts and advocated for Second Revolution, continuing social transformation. The army viewed the SA as undisciplined thugs. Hitler, needing military support for rearmament plans, chose between his revolutionary comrades and establishment alliance. On the 30th of June 1934, the night of the Long Knives, SS death squads murdered Röhm and dozens of SA leaders, along with settling scores against old enemies including former Chancellor Schleicher and Gregor Strasser, a rival Nazi leader. Hitler personally directed operations from Munich. The purge eliminated potential opposition, demonstrated Hitler's ruthlessness, and secured military loyalty. The army rewarded Hitler's butchery with acquiescence to his rearmament plans and acceptance of his dictatorship. By late 1934, transformation was complete. Germany had become a totalitarian state where Führer's word was law. Dissent meant death or concentration camp. Jewish citizens faced systematic persecution. Propaganda saturated daily life, and rearmament proceeded in violation of Versailles Treaty. The entire process from Hitler's appointment to absolute dictatorship took less than 2 years. Democracy proved far more fragile than anyone imagined, destroyed not primarily through violent coup but through legal mechanisms, political intimidation, public fear, elite collaboration, and opportunistic exploitation of crisis. Rearmament had actually begun immediately after Hitler seized power. War Minister Werner von Blomberg and Army Commander Werner von Fritsch enthusiastically supported massive military expansion. The Wehrmacht grew from the Versailles limit of 100,000 to over 500,000 by 1935. Tank production commenced. Submarine construction resumed. The military-industrial complex roared to life, simultaneously achieving Hitler's expansionist ambitions and solving unemployment crisis. By 1936, unemployment had largely vanished as men flooded into military service and armaments factories. Hitler's 1935 announcement represented a calculated risk. Would Britain and France enforce Versailles Treaty? The League of Nations had proven toothless when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, and when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. Hitler gambled correctly that Western powers, still traumatized by World War I's carnage, exhausted by Depression economics, and plagued by pacifist sentiment, would issue stern protests but take no meaningful action. British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin perfectly embodied Western paralysis. Rather than confronting German rearmament, Britain negotiated the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in June 1935, permitting Germany to build a fleet up to 35% of British naval tonnage, unilaterally legitimizing Hitler's treaty violations and betraying France by negotiating without French consultation. Hitler correctly interpreted this as weakness, encouraging further aggression. 7th March 1936. German troops crossed bridges into the Rhineland, remilitarizing the zone that had been demilitarized since Versailles. This gamble terrified Hitler's own generals. Wehrmacht Chief of Staff Ludwig Beck planned immediate withdrawal if France responded militarily. Germany possessed barely enough force to occupy the territory, let alone resist French army. Hitler later admitted, "The 48 hours after the march into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking in my life. If the French had then marched into the Rhineland, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs." But France did nothing. Prime Minister Albert Sarraut's government was weak and divided. French military doctrine emphasized defense, not offense. Elections loomed, and no politician wanted responsibility for starting war. Britain refused to support military action, with Lord Lothian famously dismissing German action as merely going into their own back garden. The League of Nations condemned Germany, but imposed no consequences. Hitler's calculated risk succeeded brilliantly, emboldening him while humiliating Western democracies and vindicating his strategic instincts over cautious generals. The Rhineland remilitarization fundamentally altered European strategic balance. French security system relied on ability to quickly attack Germany if Hitler threatened Eastern European allies like Poland or Czechoslovakia. With the Rhineland remilitarized and fortified, such intervention became exponentially harder. Hitler had successfully neutralized France's main strategic advantage while demonstrating Western unwillingness to enforce the peace settlement they had imposed. Simultaneously, ideological battle lines were hardening. The Spanish Civil War erupted in July 1936 when General Francisco Franco led nationalist military revolt against the Republican government. Germany and Italy intervened on Franco's behalf, providing aircraft, tanks, and troops. The Condor Legion's terror bombing of Guernica in April 1937 shocked the world while demonstrating Luftwaffe capabilities. The Soviet Union supported Republicans, though ineffectively. Britain and France maintained non-intervention policy that effectively aided Franco. Spain became a testing ground for weapons and tactics that would be perfected in World War II. The Spanish Civil War's international dimension revealed emerging alliance patterns. Hitler and Mussolini drew closer together, forming the Rome-Berlin axis in October 1936. Japan, pursuing its own expansionist agenda in China, joined through the Anti-Comintern Pact signed with Germany in November 1936. Ostensibly targeting Communist International, but actually signaling a union of revisionist powers determined to overturn the post-World War I order. Hitler's foreign policy combined brilliant tactical opportunism with long-term strategic vision outlined in Mein Kampf. Destroy Versailles Treaty, rearm Germany, unite all ethnic Germans, acquire Lebensraum in the East, and ultimately wage war of racial conquest against Slavic peoples in Soviet Union. Critics who dismissed Mein Kampf as mere propaganda would learn too late that Hitler meant exactly what he wrote. Economically, rearmament created contradictions that would drive Germany toward war. Historian Adam Tooze argues in The Wages of Destruction that Germany's economy by 1936 faced severe structural problems. Rearmament consumed enormous resources, creating shortages in consumer goods and raw materials. Foreign exchange reserves depleted. Four-year plan launched in 1936 under Hermann Göring aimed to achieve autarky, economic self-sufficiency, but Germany lacked essential resources like oil and rubber. The economy became increasingly structured for war because only conquest could resolve the economic contradictions created by rearmament itself. 28th May, 1937. Neville Chamberlain became British Prime Minister, bringing with him a philosophy that would define the era's greatest foreign policy disaster: appeasement. Chamberlain genuinely believed war's horrors could be avoided through reasonable negotiation, diplomatic compromise, and addressing Germany's legitimate grievances, a worldview that fundamentally misunderstood Hitler's revolutionary ambitions and mistook tactical flexibility for genuine willingness to accept a negotiated European order. Appeasement's roots ran deeper than Chamberlain's premiership. Post-World War I British society was profoundly pacifist. The Oxford Union's infamous 1933 debate resolved that this House will in no circumstances fight for king and country, symbolic of broader attitudes. Memories of the Somme and Passchendaele haunted public consciousness. Economic depression strained military budgets. The empire was overextended. Many Britons sympathized with arguments that Versailles had been too harsh, and Germany had legitimate grievances. Moreover, influential figures genuinely feared communism more than fascism. The Soviet Union appeared to threaten Western civilization itself with atheistic totalitarianism and world revolution. Nazi Germany, while distasteful, seemed a bulwark against Bolshevism. Some conservatives privately admired Hitler's destruction of German communism and restoration of order, dismissing anti-Semitism as unfortunate excess that would moderate over time. This catastrophic moral calculus blinded many to Nazism's fundamental evil. Chamberlain pursued appeasement systematically. He believed territorial adjustments addressing legitimate German grievances would satisfy Hitler, who would then become a responsible stakeholder in European order. Three assumptions underpinned this strategy. Hitler's demands were limited and rational rather than unlimited and revolutionary. Military force could not prevent German expansion given Western weakness, and negotiation would be cheaper in blood and treasure than confrontation. All three assumptions were fatally wrong. The Anschluss violated multiple treaties but proceeded without opposition. Italy, Austria's former protector, acquiesced. Mussolini had aligned with Hitler. Britain and France issued protests but took no action. The League of Nations condemned the act but imposed no sanctions. Hitler absorbed 7 million Austrians and Austria's gold reserves, industrial capacity, and strategic position. Czechoslovakia was now surrounded on three sides. German power had grown substantially, and once again Western democracies demonstrated they would not fight to enforce international law. Czechoslovakia became Hitler's next target. Approximately 3 million ethnic Germans, Sudeten Germans, lived in Czechoslovakia's border regions. Nazi agitators led by Konrad Henlein stirred unrest, making increasingly extreme demands they knew Prague could not accept. Hitler prepared for military invasion while orchestrating international crisis over alleged Czech persecution of German minorities. According to William Shirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, a definitive historical account drawing from captured Nazi documents, Hitler intended war against Czechoslovakia by autumn 1938. Czech defenses were formidable, 35 well-equipped divisions protected by mountain fortifications. France was treaty-bound to defend Czechoslovakia. The Soviet Union offered support. Germany's generals feared intervention would trigger general war. Germany could not win. Hitler dismissed these concerns, convinced Western democracies would abandon Czechoslovakia rather than fight. Throughout summer 1938, tension mounted. Hitler delivered inflammatory speeches demanding Sudeten self-determination. Czech President Edvard Beneš mobilized reserves. Europe appeared on war's brink. Chamberlain, desperate to avoid conflict, proposed direct negotiations with Hitler, an unprecedented step for British Prime Minister to supplicate to a dictator. Europe teetered on war's edge. Chamberlain returned to London deeply troubled. France mobilized reserves. Britain prepared civil defense. The Czechs refused surrender. War seemed inevitable. Then Mussolini suggested a four-power conference to resolve the crisis peacefully. Hitler, not yet confident Germany could win general war, agreed. Chamberlain eagerly accepted. The stage was set for Munich. 29th September, 1938. 4 men gathered in Munich's Führerbau to determine Czechoslovakia's fate, while no Czech representative was permitted inside the conference room. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, French Premier Édouard Daladier, Italian Duce Benito Mussolini, and German Führer Adolf Hitler would spend 13 hours negotiating an agreement that would forever symbolize appeasement's moral bankruptcy and strategic failure. The conference's outcome was predetermined. Mussolini presented a proposal, actually written by German Foreign Office, calling for Czechoslovakia to cede the Sudetenland to Germany through staged occupation beginning the 1st of October. Britain and France, desperate to avoid war, accepted with minimal modifications. The agreement gave Hitler everything he demanded, sacrificing Czech sovereignty and strategic defense to purchase what Chamberlain believed was peace. Czech representatives waited in an adjoining room, summoned after midnight on the 30th of September, to be informed their country had been dismembered. Foreign Minister Kamil Croft protested desperately. "If you have sacrificed my nation to preserve the peace of the world, I will be the first to applaud you. But if not, gentlemen, God help your souls." Britain and France pressured Prague to accept, threatening that refusal meant Czechoslovakia would face Germany alone. President Beneš, abandoned by his allies, capitulated. Czech military fortifications, superior to the Maginot Line, would pass intact to Hitler without a shot fired. Chamberlain returned to London in triumph, waving the Munich Agreement before cheering crowds at Heston Aerodrome. His famous declaration, "My good friends, for the second time in our history, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany, bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time," echoed through radio broadcasts worldwide. Massive crowds celebrated in London, Paris, and across Europe. The nightmare of war had apparently been averted through diplomatic wisdom. Only a few voices, notably Winston Churchill, recognized Munich as catastrophic defeat. Churchill delivered a devastating speech in Parliament on the 5th of October. "We have sustained a defeat without a war, the consequences of which will travel far with us along our road. We have passed an awful milestone in our journey. We have sustained a total and unmitigated defeat." He prophetically warned that Czechoslovakia's betrayal would not satisfy Hitler, but merely whet his appetite. This is only the beginning of the reckoning. This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup which will be quaffed to us year by year, unless by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigor, we arise again and take our stand for freedom, as in the olden time. Munich's strategic consequences proved devastating. Germany gained the Sudetenland's industrial resources, including the Skoda works, one of Europe's largest arms manufacturers, and 35 Czech divisions worth of military equipment. The defensible Czech border fortifications fell to Hitler intact. Czechoslovakia's truncated remnant became strategically indefensible. Hungary and Poland seized border territories in opportunistic land grabs. The Little Entente, France's Eastern European alliance system, lay in ruins as nations realized French security guarantees were worthless. More profoundly, Munich destroyed Hitler's domestic opposition. German military conspiracy against Hitler, the Oster Circle led by Chief of Staff Franz Halder and Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, had planned a coup if Hitler's Czech adventure triggered general war. When Chamberlain agreed to Munich, the coup plans evaporated. Hitler's prestige soared to unprecedented heights. His intuition had trumped cautious generals' warnings once again. The officer corps' resistance to Hitler's risk-taking was shattered. Future opposition became exponentially harder as Hitler's successes validated his leadership. Munich also demolished collective security's credibility. The Soviet Union, excluded from Munich, concluded that Western powers might redirect Hitler eastward rather than resist him. Soviet Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov had proposed joint military action to defend Czechoslovakia, but Britain and France refused. Soviet cynicism about Western intentions deepened, preparing ground for the Nazi-Soviet pact that would shock the world less than a year later. The 6 months following Munich exposed appeasement's futility. On the 9th of November, 1938, Kristallnacht, Nazi mobs destroyed Jewish businesses, burned synagogues, murdered nearly 100 Jews, and arrested 30,000 Jewish men sent to concentration camps. The pogrom's orchestrated violence revealed Nazism's barbaric nature to anyone still deluded about the regime's character. Western protests proved feeble. Immigration restrictions remained largely intact, condemning countless Jews to death. 15th March 1939. Hitler violated Munich Agreement barely 5 months after signing it. German troops occupied Prague, dissolving what remained of Czechoslovakia. Slovakia became a puppet state. Bohemia and Moravia became a German protectorate. Hitler had promised at Munich that Sudetenland represented his final territorial demand in Europe. Now he had swallowed an entire nation, demonstrating conclusively that his word was worthless and his ambitions unlimited. The Prague occupation finally shattered appeasement's illusions. Chamberlain, humiliated and furious at Hitler's betrayal, recognized that war was inevitable. British public opinion swung decisively against Germany. Parliament approved massive rearmament increases. Most significantly, Britain and France issued security guarantees to Poland and Romania, drawing a line Hitler would soon test. 31st March, 1939. Neville Chamberlain stood before the House of Commons and announced a decision that would change history's course. Britain guaranteed Poland's independence, pledging that any threat to Polish sovereignty would compel British military response. This dramatic reversal from Munich's appeasement policy represented both necessary moral stand and strategic miscalculation that would help trigger the war it aimed to prevent. The Polish guarantee's timing reflected panic rather than careful strategy. Hitler had occupied Prague only 16 days earlier, demolishing appeasement's credibility. Rumors swirled that Poland or Romania would be next targets. Chamberlain, desperate to demonstrate resolve after Munich's humiliation, issued the guarantee without fully considering its military implications or negotiating Soviet cooperation that might have made the guarantee credible. Poland's strategic position was impossible to defend from Western Europe. Germany surrounded Poland on 3 sides after absorbing Czechoslovakia. Poland shared a long border with Soviet Union, historically Poland's other mortal enemy. Britain possessed no meaningful way to provide direct military assistance. France could theoretically attack Germany's western frontier, but French doctrine emphasized static defense behind the Maginot Line, not offensive operations. The guarantee's deterrent value depended entirely on Hitler believing Britain and France would actually fight, a belief Hitler's previous experiences gave him little reason to hold. Poland itself presented complications as an alliance partner. The regime was authoritarian under Marshal Józef Pilsudski's successors. Poland had participated in Czechoslovakia's dismemberment, seizing the Teschen district opportunistically after Munich. Polish-Soviet relations remained poisonous from the 1920 war and conflicting territorial claims. Poland's foreign minister Józef Beck rejected proposals for Soviet troops to cross Polish territory to fight Germany, preferring to face Germany alone rather than allow Soviet military presence that might never leave. The immediate issue was Danzig and the Polish corridor. Danzig, a historically German city made a free city under League of Nations supervision by Versailles, was predominantly German but served as Poland's vital Baltic port access. The Polish corridor, providing Poland's access to the sea, separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Hitler demanded Danzig's return to Germany and extraterritorial highways and railways across the corridor. These demands had superficial reasonableness. They addressed genuine German grievances from Versailles, but Hitler intended them as pretexts for war, not negotiable issues. Polish leaders faced an impossible dilemma. Accepting Hitler's demands would lead to escalating ultimatums ending in Polish subordination or conquest. Czechoslovakia's fate demonstrated negotiations' futility. Rejecting Hitler's demands meant war against vastly superior German military. The British guarantee provided illusory reassurance, encouraging Polish resistance while offering no practical assistance. Poland's Foreign Minister Beck declared Poland would fight rather than accept German demands, telling Parliament on the 5th of May, "Peace is certainly a precious and desirable thing. Our generation, bloodily drenched in the wars, certainly deserves peace. But peace, like almost everything in this world, has its price, high but definable. We in Poland do not recognize the conception of peace at any price." Meanwhile, Britain and France conducted half-hearted negotiations with the Soviet Union for a mutual assistance pact. Stalin, deeply suspicious after Munich's exclusion, and convinced Western powers might direct Hitler eastward, demanded British-French-Soviet military alliance with automatic mutual assistance and Soviet right to occupy Baltic states and eastern Poland if war came. Britain and France temporized, sending low-level delegations without authority to make binding commitments. The negotiations proceeded with glacial slowness through summer 1939, fatally undermining the one alliance that might have deterred Hitler. Hitler watched these diplomatic maneuvers with contempt and calculation. He intended to wage war against Poland regardless of Western guarantees, gambling that Britain and France would again choose humiliation over war. However, he needed insurance against fighting simultaneously on eastern and western fronts, the strategic nightmare that had doomed Germany in World War I. If Soviet Union remained neutral or better yet became Germany's partner, Hitler could destroy Poland quickly, then turn west if Britain and France actually declared war. The possibility of Nazi-Soviet alliance seemed absurd. Nazism and communism were ideological enemies. Hitler had built his career on anti-Bolshevik rhetoric. Stalin had positioned Soviet Union as fascism's primary opponent. Yet both dictators possessed cynical pragmatism, transcending ideology when strategic interest demanded. Hitler needed Soviet neutrality to attack Poland. Stalin, convinced Western powers were unreliable partners, needed time to prepare for eventual German attack while potentially regaining territories lost after World War I. Secret contacts between Germany and Soviet Union accelerated through summer 1939. Soviet Foreign Minister Litvinov, a Jew and advocate of collective security, was replaced in May by Vyacheslav Molotov, signaling possible policy shift. Trade negotiations between Germany and Soviet Union provided cover for political discussions. Hitler dangled territorial concessions, Soviet control over eastern Poland, Baltic states, and Bessarabia, that Britain and France would never offer. 23 August 1939, news exploded across world headlines that stunned global observers. Germany and Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact. Foreign Ministers Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov affixed signatures to an agreement pledging 10 years of peace between Nazi Germany and Communist Soviet Union. The public treaty was shocking enough. The secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence, revealed only after World War II, were even more cynical. Poland would be partitioned. Baltic states would fall to Soviet control. Stalin would receive territorial gains while Hitler gained freedom to attack Poland without fearing Soviet intervention. The Nazi-Soviet pact's impact was seismic. Communist parties worldwide reeled from Moscow's betrayal of anti-fascist principles. Western diplomacy lay in ruins. The potential deterrent of Soviet-Western alliance had evaporated. Poland's strategic situation became hopeless. Most significantly, Hitler had eliminated the two-front war danger, clearing the path for Polish invasion. 25 August, 1939. Adolf Hitler sat in his Berghof mountain retreat reviewing final invasion plans for Poland, scheduled to commence at 4:30 the following morning. Then shocking news arrived. Britain had formalized its Polish guarantee into a formal mutual assistance pact, and Italy informed Hitler that despite the Rome-Berlin axis, Mussolini would not enter war immediately. Hitler, surprised that Britain might actually fight this time, postponed the invasion at the last possible moment. For 6 days, Europe balanced on war's precipice while diplomats conducted frantic final negotiations. The British-Polish treaty signed on the 25th demonstrated that Britain had learned from Munich's mistakes, or at least from its political consequences. Chamberlain, though still desperately hoping to avoid war, recognized that another betrayal would destroy his government and Britain's international credibility. Parliament and public opinion demanded resistance to further German aggression. The treaty committed Britain to defend Poland against German attack, removing ambiguity that had plagued earlier guarantees. Mussolini's hesitation reflected Italy's military weakness. Despite bombastic rhetoric, Italian armed forces were unprepared for major war. Defeats in Ethiopia had exposed military deficiencies. Industrial production lagged far behind Germany's. Mussolini, though ideologically aligned with Hitler, prudently declined to enter a war Italy was unprepared to fight. Hitler felt betrayed, but could not allow Italian weakness to derail his carefully orchestrated crisis. From the 26th to the 31st of August, final diplomatic maneuvers unfolded with surreal quality. All participants knew war was coming, yet maintained pretense that negotiation might succeed. Hitler issued demands for Poland to send plenipotentiary to Berlin with full authority to negotiate territorial concessions, a deliberately humiliating requirement designed to be rejected. Poland, remembering how Czech President Hacha was bullied into surrender during a Berlin visit, refused to send representative without prior agreement on negotiating framework. Sweden's Birger Dahlerius conducted unofficial mediation between Britain and Germany, shuttling between London and Berlin with proposals and counter-proposals. Dahlerius, a Swedish businessman with contacts in both capitals, genuinely believed he could broker peace. His naive efforts were exploited by Hitler to create impression Germany sought reasonable settlement while Poland was intransigent. In reality, Hitler had irreversibly decided on war. The diplomatic theater served propaganda purposes, providing justification for German public and international consumption. Hitler's immediate circle understood war was inevitable. Hermann Göring, despite reservations about fighting Britain, prepared the Luftwaffe for combat. The Wehrmacht's meticulously planned Operation White, invasion of Poland, awaited only Hitler's order. Reinhard Heydrich organized SS task forces, Einsatzgruppen, to follow army units and eliminate Polish intelligentsia, clergy, and Jews. The invasion would be not merely military operation, but racial war aimed at destroying Poland as a nation. The German military's mood mixed confidence with apprehension. Wehrmacht commanders felt certain of rapid victory against Poland, whose armed forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and utilizing obsolescent tactics. However, many generals feared Britain and France would honor their commitments, creating two-front war Germany might not win. Chief of Staff Franz Halder wrote in his diary that war with Western powers over Poland was madness. But Hitler had successfully broken military opposition's backbone through previous victories. Generals who objected were ignored or removed. Those who remained implemented Hitler's orders despite private misgivings. 31st August 1939. As final hours of peace ticked away, Hitler ordered one of history's most cynical provocations. SS operatives dressed in Polish uniforms attacked the German radio station at Gleiwitz in Upper Silesia, broadcast anti-German messages, then left behind corpses of concentration camp prisoners dressed as Polish soldiers. This manufactured incident provided Hitler with proof of Polish aggression. At 9 in the evening, Hitler issued Directive No. 1 for the conduct of war. Now that all political possibilities of disposing by peaceful means of a situation on the eastern frontier, which is intolerable for Germany, are exhausted, I have determined on a solution by force. In Warsaw, Polish leaders recognized war was hours away. Ambassador Joseph Lipski informed Foreign Minister Beck that Britain was urging Poland to negotiate, but Beck maintained that accepting German demands would be national suicide. Poland would fight, trusting that British and French guarantees meant something and hoping their sacrifice would rally Western democracies to destroy Nazi Germany before it was too late. Polish civilians received mobilization orders. Reservists reported to units. Cities prepared for air raids. A nation of 35 million braced for invasion by Europe's most formidable military machine. In London, Parliament convened in emergency session. Chamberlain, exhausted and disillusioned, hoped desperately for a miracle that would avoid war. He knew Britain was unprepared to fight. Britain had begun rearmament only after Munich, and though production accelerated rapidly, the military remained inferior to Germany's in most categories. The Royal Air Force was expanding, but outnumbered by the Luftwaffe. The British Army, though professional and well-trained, was tiny compared to Wehrmacht. The Royal Navy dominated seas but could not help Poland directly. If war came, Britain would enter conflict for principle rather than immediate strategic advantage, a rare occurrence in international relations that demonstrated both moral courage and strategic desperation. In Paris, Premier Édouard Daladier faced similar dilemmas with even less enthusiasm. France possessed Europe's largest army, but was psychologically exhausted from World War I's trauma and politically divided between left and right extremes. French military doctrine emphasized defense, and the Maginot Line fortifications encouraged passive mentality, ill-suited to rescuing distant allies. France would honor its treaty obligations to Poland, but French military planning offered little prospect of effective assistance. As midnight approached on the 31st of August, final messages crossed between capitals. Hitler refused to see British Ambassador Neville Henderson, who desperately sought one last conversation. Polish Ambassador Lipski attempted to see German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop, but was rebuffed. The diplomatic mechanisms for preventing war had collapsed or been deliberately destroyed. All that remained was waiting for the violence to begin. 1st September, 1939. At 4:45 in the morning, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, ostensibly on a courtesy visit to Danzig, opened fire on Polish fortifications at Westerplatte, while German bombers struck Polish airfields and German armored columns crashed across the frontier at multiple points. World War II had begun, though the term would not be used until the conflict's scale became clear. Within hours, 60 divisions of Wehrmacht troops supported by 2,000 aircraft invaded Poland in a campaign demonstrating the revolutionary blitzkrieg tactics that would transform modern warfare. Polish forces fought bravely but were overwhelmed by German material superiority and tactical innovation. The Wehrmacht's combined arms approach, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and close air support, shattered Polish defensive lines. Stuka dive bombers terrorized troops and civilians with their distinctive sirens. Panzer divisions exploited breakthroughs, racing deep behind Polish lines to encircle defending armies. The Luftwaffe established air superiority within days, devastating Polish communications, transportation, and command structure. Polish cavalry units, despite later myths, fought with modern weapons, not medieval lances, but their courage could not compensate for obsolescent organization and insufficient heavy equipment. Hitler addressed the Reichstag on the 1st of September with characteristic mendacity, claiming Poland had attacked Germany and describing himself as first soldier of the German Reich, wearing military tunic he would not remove until victory was achieved, or, with theatrical pause, he would not survive the outcome. The speech combined self-pity, lies about Polish aggression, and apocalyptic rhetoric about Germany's right to living space. The Reichstag, now a rubber stamp assembly, erupted in orchestrated cheers. The German population, despite enthusiastic rallies staged by propaganda ministry, greeted war with anxiety rather than 1914's jubilation. Britain and France faced their moment of truth. Would they honor Polish guarantees or find excuses for inaction? For 2 days, Western powers hesitated. Chamberlain hoped diplomatic pressure might secure German withdrawal without war. French military mobilization proceeded with bureaucratic sluggishness. Italian Duce Mussolini proposed another conference to resolve the crisis peacefully. But this time, public opinion and parliamentary pressure left governments no escape. Polish resistance was fierce enough and Hitler's aggression brazen enough that abandoning Poland would destroy Western governments and credibility. 3rd September 1939, at 11:15 in the morning London time, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's voice crackled across radio broadcasts to millions of listeners throughout British Empire. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that, unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. Chamberlain's voice betrayed exhaustion and profound sadness. The man who had dedicated his premiership to preserving peace now announced war's arrival. He concluded with poignant reflection. You can imagine what a bitter blow it is to me that all my long struggle to win peace has failed. Yet I cannot believe that there is anything more or anything different that I could have done, and that would have been more successful. He was wrong. Earlier confrontation when German rearmament began, alliance with Soviet Union, meaningful support for Czechoslovakia, all these might have prevented or limited war. But Chamberlain, like millions of his generation, had been shaped by World War I's trauma into believing almost any sacrifice was justified to avoid repeating that catastrophe. This understandable but fatal assumption led to policies that made larger catastrophe inevitable. France declared war on Germany at 5 in the afternoon, Paris time the same day. Australia, New Zealand, and India quickly followed Britain's declaration. Canada would declare war on the 10th of September. South Africa, after heated debate, joined on the 6th of September. The British Empire, spanning a quarter of Earth's land surface, was now at war with Nazi Germany. Yet this global conflict began with distinctly limited military action. The phony war, or Sitzkrieg, commenced. France and Britain were technically at war with Germany but conducted no offensive operations to relieve pressure on Poland. French military plans called for mobilization lasting weeks before launching offensive. When limited operations finally began along German frontier, French troops advanced tentatively into empty Saar territory, encountered light resistance from outnumbered German border troops, then withdrew behind the Maginot Line when Polish defeat became clear. Britain sent a British expeditionary force to France, but it was tiny compared to forces mobilized in 1914. No strategic bombing campaign targeted German war industries despite pre-war expectations that war would begin with massive air raids. Western allies were at war, but not conducting war, having issued guarantees to Poland, then failing to provide meaningful military assistance during Poland's death struggle. Polish resistance, though ultimately futile, displayed remarkable courage. The siege of Warsaw continued until the 27th of September, with civilians and military mounting desperate defense. Polish government fled eastward, attempting to organize continued resistance. But Poland faced catastrophe from new direction. On the 17th of September, Soviet forces invaded from the east, implementing the Nazi-Soviet Pact's secret protocols. Poland was crushed between two totalitarian powers. Polish forces, already reeling from German onslaught, now faced Soviet invasion from opposite direction. The Second Polish Republic, resurrected after World War I, ceased to exist after barely 20 years of independence. The Nazi-Soviet partition of Poland shocked world opinion even more than the pact itself had done. Communists worldwide struggled to explain how Soviet Union, supposedly champion of oppressed peoples, was now collaborating with fascist Germany to dismember a neighboring country. The joint German-Soviet military parade in Brest-Litovsk on the 22nd of September, where Wehrmacht and Red Army officers reviewed troops marching together, symbolized the cynical alliance of convenience between two dictatorships that hated each other ideologically, but found common interest in dividing the spoils. By early October, organized Polish resistance had collapsed. The government had fled to Romania. Over 100,000 Polish troops escaped to fight another day. Many would distinguish themselves in subsequent campaigns in France, Britain, Italy, and elsewhere. But Poland itself vanished from map, divided between German and Soviet occupation zones. German-occupied Poland experienced brutal occupation from the start. SS Einsatzgruppen began systematic elimination of Polish intelligentsia, clergy, and Jewish population. Soviet-occupied eastern Poland suffered mass deportations of class enemies to Siberian labor camps. Poland's nightmare had begun. Britain and France found themselves at war but without clear strategy for actually defeating Germany. Naval blockade would take years to strangle German economy. Strategic bombing was more theoretical than practical in 1939. Land invasion of Germany was strategically impossible given Maginot Line mentality and German Western fortifications. The Western Allies hoped time was on their side, that British and French rearmament would eventually create conventional superiority while German economy weakened under blockade. This passive strategy depended on Germany obliging by waiting to be strangled. Hitler had no such intention. The war that began on the 1st of September 1939 resulted from the toxic combination of Versailles Treaty's punitive provisions that fostered German resentment, economic chaos of depression that empowered extremists, Western democracy's failure to confront aggression early when costs would have been manageable, Hitler's revolutionary ambitions that transcended rational calculations of national interest, Soviet Union's cynical opportunism, and Polish nationalism's refusal to accept subordination. 20 years after the war to end all wars, humanity had failed to build lasting peace. The conflagration that followed would claim over 70 million lives and reshape world order fundamentally. The Second World War's origins lay not in single cause but in cascading failures. Statesmen who prioritized short-term peace over long-term security, generals who prepared for previous war rather than next one, publics traumatized by past conflict into passivity before new threats, and demagogues who exploited fear, resentment, and prejudice for totalitarian purposes. As Winston Churchill, who had warned of approaching catastrophe throughout the 1930s, would later write, "There never was a war more easy to stop than that which has just wrecked what was left of the world from the previous struggle." The tragedy was that it need not have happened. Yet when it came with terrible inevitability that decades of choices had created. The world would emerge from the coming catastrophe transformed beyond recognition, with Europe's colonial empires crumbling, new superpowers dominating global politics, weapons capable of destroying civilization, and haunting questions about human nature's capacity for both evil and sacrifice that resonate to this day.